Good evening, Christ is risen. I am Carrie Frederick Frost, the chair of the St. Phoebe Center for the Deaconess, and I welcome all of you. This is an event that is part of a series of events celebrating St. Phoebe Center's 10th year anniversary as an organization. And this event tonight is co-sponsored with Holy Cross Orthodox Press. This event is called The Legacy of Rhodes, featuring the book Deaconesses, A Tradition for Today and Tomorrow, recently published by Holy Cross Orthodox Press. And I would like for us to start with a prayer, please. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Most holy Phoebe, who was found to be worthy of the diaconate, who was Paul's helper and carried his words to the people of Rome, who was called the lamp of Centuria, we now humbly ask that you intercede for us and pray to Christ our God as we discern his will for the revival of the ordained female diaconate for the upbuilding of the entire church today. Pray that we will be blessed and fruitful in our works this day and always to God's glory. Amen. Christ is risen.
Truly is risen.
Now let me tell you a little bit more about the St. Phoebe Center. In 2013, the St. Phoebe Center for the Deaconess was born out of a conversation at a coffee shop about the hope for deaconesses in the Orthodox Church today. Our mission is to educate and prayerfully advocate for the revival of the ordained female diaconate to help serve the ministerial needs of the Orthodox Church and the world today. In our first decade, we lifted up the history of deaconesses and the need for the restoration of this order. Now, as we move into our second decade, we will build on this foundation and turn our attention to how the Orthodox Church can restore deaconesses. Many of our board and advisory board members are here this evening. I would love for you to just raise your Zoom hand so people know who you are. Thank you for being here tonight. And we are celebrating St. Phoebe Center's anniversary year by offering a series of public events, both Zoom sessions like this one and an in-person symposium in the fall. Information about all of these can be found on our website, orthodoxdeaconesses.org. And Zoom events in the coming months include Girls and Women's Liturgical Service on June 25th, co-sponsored with Oxia Women, Myth Busting, addressing the myths around deaconesses on July 19th, Church of Our Granddaughters by yours truly, an evening with the author on September 3rd. And then our in-person symposium on the theme of Deaconesses for the Orthodox Church today will be held November 10th through 12th. At Holy Cross Hellenic College in Boston, Massachusetts. More information about the symposium is coming soon, so please be on your lookout on our website or in our newsletters. We would love for you to join us. We also want to inform you about an upcoming Zoom event having to do with deaconesses, sponsored by the Orthodox Theological Society in America, also known as OTSA. That is Women in the Church, Theological Anthropology and the Female Diaconate After Rhodes, and that will be on June 8th. Finally, we invite you to support St. Phoebe Center's work in other ways. Join us as a supporter. Add your name to the growing list of people on our website who support deaconesses in the church once again. Join our network. You could join our growing number of people who want to volunteer with St. Phoebe Center. Join us as a donor. We are a U.S. nonprofit and we need your financial support to do our mission. And all of this can happen on our website, orthodoxdeaconesses.org. So now to tonight's event, The Legacy of Rhodes, featuring the book, Deaconesses, A Tradition for Today and Tomorrow. In 1988, Ecumenical Patriarch Demetrios I convened a week-long inter-Orthodox consultation in Rhodes, Greece, on the place of the woman in the Orthodox Church and the question of the ordination of women. This consultation was part of the planning of a church-wide council, which ultimately happened in 2016, though in a different form than originally envisioned, and it did not address the issue of deaconesses. Another reason for the Rhodes Consultation was that many other Christian traditions around the world were beginning to welcome women into their clergy, and the Rhodes Consultation was an effort to address the question of women in the clergy from an Orthodox perspective. The consultation included delegates from 12 of the autocephalous churches at the time and speakers from various Orthodox jurisdictions. A document was released from the Rhodes Consultation, and it included statements on theological anthropology about what it means to be women and men, It generally recommended an increase in the roles of women in the Orthodox Church, but not as priests or bishops. And it specifically affirmed the legitimacy of and the need for the restoration of deaconesses, stating without qualification, quote, "The apostolic order of deaconesses should be revived," end quote. The Rhodes Consultation concluded that there was ample evidence for this ministry from apostolic times well into the Byzantine period, that the deaconess was ordained to higher orders, and that such a revival today would represent a positive response to the many needs and demands of the contemporary world. The consultation at Rhodes was a pivotal event. It represents the first international Orthodox consensus on the restoration of deaconesses in the modern period, and it is from this consensus that all subsequent conferences and conversations examining the issue have been based. So 35 years later, here we are, and we are asking, what is the legacy of Rhodes? What is the legacy of the Rhodes Consultation? What has happened in terms of Orthodox thinking, practice, or scholarship regarding women in the Orthodox Church since Rhodes? Why has there been so little movement on the reinstitution of deaconesses in the 35 years since Rhodes? How does the legacy of Rhodes inform or shape questions of how the Orthodox Church might reinstitute the ordained order of deaconesses? So those are the questions before us this evening. But first, I want to welcome the very Reverend Dr. Anton C. Vrame, Director of Holy Cross Orthodox Press, to offer a few words on Holy Cross's publication of this new book that is dedicated to the legacy of the Rhodes Consultation, Deaconesses, A Tradition for Today and Tomorrow, edited by Reverend Dr. John Chryssavgis, Dr. Niki Papageorgiou, Ms. Marilyn Rouvelas, and Dr. Petros Vassiliadis. Many people who are here tonight contributed to this book in one way or another, either as an editor or an author of a chapter. And those of you that contributed, I would invite you to raise your Zoom hand or wave so people know who you are. So let me note that in your registration email, you were given discount codes for purchasing the book from Holy Cross Orthodox Press, and those will work from now until May 30th. So I welcome Father Tony, and you have the floor to offer us a few comments about this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Yeah, you took my opening away, that there's a discount on the book, and there's a discount on the book that we published many, many years ago by Kyriaki Fitzgerald on women deacons in the Orthodox Church. So if you haven't read that one, I would highly recommend it. I'll say a little bit about that one for those of you who aren't familiar with it. It's Kyriaki, Dr. Fitzgerald's kind of take on the work and the legacy of the work of the late Professor Evangelos Theodorou, who in the modern days pioneered the idea of restoring the diaconate of women. So that's one. So I see this book, first and foremost, as a continuation of things that the press has published on the topic, one. And secondly, from my perspective, when this project was presented to us, this is really, really solid work from a wide variety of voices that needs to be shared. And so we jumped on the possibility of publishing it. I said, secondly, related to that, is that I hope that the conversation expands beyond, as we would say, preaching to the choir. I would suspect that most everybody on this webinar feels very strongly about this issue, but this is an idea whose time has come, but still needs a lot of work, as they would say, in the fields to convince a lot of other people and to share these ideas. And the variety of perspectives presented in the book, I think, is really helpful here, because you can see the fits and starts. You can see of the effort. I was reading one of the pieces about the ancient art that's showing women deacons, or convinced that it's women deacons anyways. So there's that. And so for us, it's just, again, one more step in this process of helping the church think about this topic. And so our job, your job, is to share that thinking with others, but also at the same time, help church leadership begin to take action on the topic, and not just here in the United States. This is a global concern, and the authors themselves are global, and so that too becomes an important piece of it. So from my perspective, I see just a book that's a collection of really excellent scholarship on the topic that needs to be shared from a wide variety of perspectives that I think further the conversation on the ordination of women to the diaconate. And so if you haven't read it, I'll tell you, I'll be crassly commercial and say, buy the book, buy copies for your friends, take advantage. But again, to talk about the issue and to share this issue, even at the parish level, to help people understand what this is all about, where it comes from. It's not some crazy idea from outside of ourselves, but something from deep within who we are as Orthodox. And I'll just leave it at that.
Great. Thank you, Father Tony. Thanks for being here with us tonight. And thank you for the work the press has done. I mean, I speak as an unbiased party who doesn't stand to benefit from the sales of this book. It is a wonderful volume, and you're absolutely right that it's a continuation of the tradition of the press to investigate this issue. So thank you for that. And now we will get started with our esteemed panelists. I will briefly introduce each one at a time, each one in turn, and we will hear from them for 10 or 12 minutes. Once we've heard from all of them, we will then turn to you, the audience, for your questions. And you are welcome to type questions into the written chat as we go along, or raise your hand on Zoom once we get to that question and answer time period, and I will call on you at that time. So first, we will welcome Dr. Valerie Karras. She is professor, author, and lecturer in historical theology. She is a member of St. Phoebe Center's advisory board, and we are so glad she's here tonight. Valerie, you have the floor.
Thanks, Carrie. I'm really happy to be here and very honored to have been invited to participate in this. The conference in Rhodes was actually held just a month or two after I arrived in Thessaloniki to work on my second doctorate. And I tried desperately to get myself invited to the Rhodes conference, but was unsuccessful in that. And if you've looked at the book that Yanadios Lamouris edited that had the collected papers from the conference, you'll see a photo in there. And out of the 70 or 80 participants, there is in fact only a handful of women. I was fortunate that one of the members of my committee, my dissertation committee in Thessaloniki at the time, was Foundoulis, Ioannis Foundoulis, the great Greek liturgical scholar. And so when he came back from the conference, he made copies for me of all of the papers so I could see them. If you were to see the originals of some of these papers and the original conclusions of one of the two working groups that they split the conference into, you would be appalled at some of the theology presented in it, which got cleaned up before the published proceedings appeared in print. I wanted to give you guys a little synopsis. Most of you, I'm sure, are already familiar with this, but for those few who may not be, there really should be no question about the issue of whether there were women ordained to the diaconate in early and Byzantine Christianity. We have so much documentation of this in a variety of forms. We have everything from church canons through ecclesiastical legislation, ecclesiastical and nomo-canonical, so for legislation from emperors such as Justinian, most notably, to actual physical evidence from epitaphs, from graves, and hagiographical evidence. And all of this shows us that there were women from apostolic times, and hence the name the St. Phoebe Center, through to at least the end of the Middle Byzantine period, who were ordained to the diaconate. We have the ordination rites. They're quite full in the manuals, the church manuals from the Middle Byzantine period, and they are virtually identical to the ordination of male deacons. I always found a couple of things particularly convincing in terms of how the people of that time viewed the female diaconate, that it saw it as equal to the male diaconate. One is the fact that at the linguistic level, that the common word used is diakonos, which is a masculine ending noun, but with the feminine article. So you do also see the word diakonissa used, but remember, just as with the word presbytera, diakonissa can mean the wife of a deacon, as presbytera can mean the wife of a presbyter or priest. So that can be confusing. So the use of the word diakonos with the feminine article left no confusion whatsoever. A second, which I find really convincing, if you look at these, what are called evcholoia, they're church manuals. Some of them have the ordination rites in an ascending order from the lower ordinations of readers, subdeacons, that sort of thing, up to the consecration of a bishop. Others have them in a descending order, starting with the bishop and presbyter and going on down to the lower orders. In both cases, regardless of whether these were put in an ascending or order, the ordination rite for the female deacon is listed immediately after that of the male deacon, and in fact, in several instances, simply says something about it's done just the same. These, 2 or 3 differences. So I think that's really important to see how they saw the ordination, that they understood it to be a true ordination. The last thing I would say about it that I think is another form of convincing, it's a kind of an odd one, but I think they were a little uncomfortable with the idea of women being ordained, even though they were doing it. And that would help explain why you see the rules regarding who can be ordained to the female diaconate being so much more rigorous than those for the male diaconate. So where male deacons can be ordained at the age of 25, female deacons had to be at least 60. Later, they lowered it to 40, where male deacons could be married. Female deacons could not. They could be widowed, but they could only have been widowed once. Those sorts of things. And the penalties for female deacons who broke their vows of celibacy were more onerous than for their male deacon counterparts. It's just a little summary of some of the. We do know that that female deacons had a more limited ministry. It was primarily geared to female parishioners for reasons of propriety. Those reasons have not been eliminated today. And so the question becomes, when you look at why hasn't more been done since Rhodes? Why hasn't more progress been made? After Evangelos Theodorou's dissertation and its publication in the mid-1950s, there was a push within the Church of Greece. They actually opened a school for deaconesses, and yet no deaconesses got ordained. It's hard to tell in some cases why these things happen. Certain things are local in nature. The Russian church was looking at the female diaconate, even though they actually had no real history of it, but they were looking at it at the great council that was held on the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution. And then the revolution occurred, and of course, everything paikameni, as we say in Greek. So we see different reasons at different times and places. I think one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with today, and this came out in at least a couple of the articles in the book, is that here in the West, particularly here in the United States, which is so religiously diverse, we have a number of converts to Orthodoxy. And many of these converts have come out of communities that do have the ordination of women, and they were running from that, or they have come from evangelical backgrounds that also, that on the contrary, had a very segregated notion of what men and women may do in the church. I taught at Southern Methodist University in Dallas for 7 years, and there are churches down there like called the Church of Christ, the Church of God, that do not allow women to do anything in the church beyond teach Sunday school to young children. They won't permit any kind of activity liturgically or pedagogically beyond that. So when you look at this, you look at who are the people who are opposing the restoration of the female diaconate today and why we aren't making more progress, I think this is one of the issues that we're facing, is the idea, the misbegotten idea that this comes out of secular feminism and therefore is not somehow intrinsically Orthodox, which is rather curious since we had a history of over a millennium of the female diaconate. But these are the realities that we're fighting against, is the sort of distorted history and distorted what we call theological anthropology, the understanding of who we are as human beings in a theological sense, and what maleness and femaleness mean in that respect with regard to our participation in the life of the church.
Great, Valerie. Thank you. That was a wonderful framing of the issues on the table tonight. And I thought your comments about discomfort were really interesting. This idea that the early church was uncomfortable with ordaining women. And one of the things that tells me is that what is right and true isn't always comfortable. Just seems like something interesting to keep in mind. So thank you. We will move on now to Reverend Dr. Alviadis, Kalivas, Emeritus Professor of Holy Cross Hellenic College, who was present at the Rhodes Consultation, as I understand it. We are so happy to have you here, and you have the floor for about 10 minutes or so. Welcome. It looks like you're not yet unmuted, but you're trying.
All right, I think I'm on now.
We can hear you. Yes.
Thank you again, Professor, for the introduction. I was at that conference, much younger. Perhaps we put a great deal of emphasis on the positive aspects of the Congress, and perhaps we have too many hopeful things that could have come from it. But it wasn't so. There were essentially two objectives to the conference. One was to emphasize as much as possible that the Orthodox Church was not in favor of ordaining women to the priesthood, but very much supportive of the ordination, or at least the revival, thinking about the revival of the woman diaconate, the female diaconate. There was a great deal of support for that part of the conference. One of the opening talks was very, let me say that there were two things that happened in the conference. One was humorous, the other was a personal issue. The humorous one.
Father, are you able to look at the camera, to look at your camera? We would love to see your face. Yes, there you are.
Fine, but I mean, it's an awkward
Okay.
position. The way it's been picked there, it's very hard for me to.
Understood. Do the best you can. We just love seeing your face. Thank you.
One of the presenters had some very unkind words to say about women in general and the feminist movement, but his remarks were not generous at all. And after he completed his talk, one of the more conservative members of the group and a well-known theologian, the late Father John Romanidis, was the first to raise his hand. And he asked the professor that gave the talk if he had read his paper to his wife first. And the whole people gathered laughed with the interchange there. The more difficult one, what happened to me on the second day, when I had raised the issue, if the ordination of women is a doctrinal issue or a very definite issue of tradition. And I was pulled aside after to tell me that I wasn't brought to the conference to raise issues such as that. The church, he told me, is clear on that issue and no need to raise it. In one of the subcommittees, the discussion, again, how valuable the ordination of women would be for the church, especially the Russian church. They were very, very much in favor of this. And they said one of the reasons was it would help with the pastoral ministry. There were so few men who were seeking to become priests, and that if they had the possibility of ordaining females to the diaconate, that it would help the church tremendously at that time. It seems to me that it was a beginning, the conference in Rome. It was a beginning. It was not an end. And nobody seemed to have picked up after the conference to move the agenda forward. Who knows for what reason. I have a few comments I'd like to make about the revival. There are those in the church who say anything that has fallen into disuse should not be revived. Others who say that the restoration of liturgical practices, when they are called for, they should be revived. And if we find something faulty, even if it has been celebrated for hundreds of years, even so, if it's faulty, it should be corrected. And that was Saint Simeon of Thessaloniki who said that. I'd like to address a couple of issues relating to the ordination to the diaconate of women. I was asked several years ago, many years ago, by Archbishop Iakovos, from the perspective of liturgy and more in general of the pastoral dimensions of the question, what I thought about the possibility of ordaining someone here in the United States and to begin a process by which this can be fulfilled. I don't remember everything that I wrote to him, but I do remember a number of issues, so I'll address those. The first and foremost is the issue of age. And Dr. Karras raised the issue that it is now, at least in the canonical tradition, 40 years old. Another issue is the marital status. Should the woman be married or single? And does it matter? And what if it is a priest's wife? Does that matter? Even more so. Does that create problems for the priest, the community, etc.? What kind of education should this woman have? Is it necessary that she have a full theological education? If she's trained in other fields, what field? More importantly, what are the duties of the deaconess in the church. They were very limited in the ancient church from the literature that we have. She assisted in the baptism of women and children. She had no role in the divine liturgy. As the deacon had a very prominent role. Is it possible for the church to give her those roles today? Questions that need to be asked, questions that need to be answered. What are her duties and responsibilities of the deaconess? And especially, what are her duties in the liturgical, especially the divine liturgy? What about the external dress of the female deaconess? And what about we know clearly that her liturgical garments were the same as the male deacon. So that is no problem. Then I said, one of the most important issues that really face the church is you just can't ordain someone, especially reviving an order, without having already prepared the people for something like this. So there would have to be a process of preparation of the communities to be able to understand what this ordination means and how well prepared are the people to receive it. Then I suggested that perhaps one would have to need a select parish or parishes to be able to do this. These parishes would have to be, for the most part, I hate to use the word progressive, but I'll use it for now anyway, to be able to say, we understand why we have this restoration of this office, and we are glad for it and rejoice in it. So there would have to be a combining of a particular select parish with select women in the beginning as this process would begin. Then what are the canonical and disciplinary issues that are related to the office of the deacon? Those were some of the questions that I posed to the Archbishop at the time. Now, why haven't we moved further along in the process since Rhodes? I suppose there's only one real answer to that: a lack of will. Perhaps the issue is too complex for some people this time, and as usually happens, the louder voices seem to prevail, and the others who want revival, renewal, restorations are not heard as easily. So I'll leave my comments to that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Father. So we saw in the chat that you are about to go to Greece to receive an honorary doctorate from the Faculty of Theology at the University of Athens. So we all want to say Axios.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations, worthy. Thank you for your comments. I appreciate the first person perspective on the Rhodes Consultation and the acknowledgement that it's a mixed legacy. And these questions that you raise about that need to be answered before the church restores this order of age and marital status and education, like the brass tacks. Those are things that the St. Phoebe Center aims to address in our coming years, and specifically at our November symposium, to really help the church think about how we would go about this. So thanks for bringing that up for us. Now we will go to our next panelist, and let me just remind everyone here, you are welcome to put questions in the chat as we go along, and then we'll pick them up when we get to a question and answer part of the evening and just a little bit here. And you'll also be welcome to raise your Zoom hand at that point in time and ask your questions aloud as well. But for now, I would like to welcome Dr. Patricia Fan-Buteneff, who is the president of Oxia Women, a network by, for, and about Orthodox women in the service of Christ, and she is here to share some perspectives on women in the church today. Thank you for being with us, and you have the floor.
Thank you. It is great to be here, and I really thank you for inviting me, especially with legends like Dr. Valerie Karas and Dr. Alcibiades Kalivas. So I really thank you. As we know, and as we've just been hearing, the bishops at the commission at Rhodes, although they produced a document in favor of ordaining women to the diaconate, not a single bishop there ever did ordain a deaconess. And we've already heard a little bit about why, or possibly about why. But it's not because there weren't potential candidates. Even in 1988, women were graduating from seminaries like Holy Cross and St. Vladimir's with master's degrees in theology who potentially could have become as qualified as their male peers for ordination. And so by supporting diaconal ordination in word, but not in deed, the Rhodes bishops can be said to have effectively prevented women from doing diaconal work, at least in this last 35 years. You could say that, but I wonder if that is actually true. I mean, and to answer that question, we really have to consider what diaconal work in fact consists of and what women are in fact achieving in the church. Deacon John Chryssavgis provides perspective and context when he writes, "A fuller vision of the ordained ministry should recognize the role of the bishop as the bond of unity and spokesman for doctrine. Likewise, it should respect the role of the presbyter for celebrating the presence of Christ in the local community. And it should also recognize the role of deacon as a servant in completing and complementing the circle of unity and community in the local church. And service by deacons goes beyond liturgics and reaches the community with gifts such as administration, education, pastoral and spiritual counseling, and youth work." So please keep his words in mind as we start to consider the roles that women play in church and parachurch organizations throughout the United States, which is the part of the Orthodox world that I know best. So many of these roles fall precisely within the parameters of what we have just heard as constitutive of diaconal work: administration, counseling, education, youth work, along with other roles that complete and complement the vital circle of unity for our communities. So because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to just walk you through a list of these roles. And I also want you to keep in mind that this is not exhaustive. It derives from surveys that we have run at my organization at Oxia, plus the 40 plus interviews that I do with women annually as part of my work for Oxia. And most of these women, they're leaders of one kind or another in their church or in parachurch organizations, and they hold multiple, each of them holds multiple such roles at any one time. Oh, and also just so you know, I'm honored that in her book, Church of Our Granddaughters, Carrie Frederick Frost found it worthwhile to summarize and expand my original version of this list. And she did such a great job of it that I've borrowed it back again and done the same thing to it. So here are the categories. They're in alphabetical order of some kinds of diaconal and extra diaconal work that women are doing for our church in the United States. So administration. These are women who are abbesses of monasteries or leaders of other Orthodox groups, including trustees and directors of seminaries and other nonprofit boards, such as here at St. Phoebe. And some of those institutions with significant boards that have women on them include the Patriarch Athenagoras Institute, St. Vladimir Seminary, St. Sophia Seminary, Hellenic College Holy Cross Seminary, St. Tikhon Seminary, International Orthodox Christian Charities, St. Basil's Academy, and the Orthodox Christian Mission Center. And there are many more. And then there are catalysts, founders, and activists. So these are women who act as change agents. They saw a need and stepped up to take care of it. Some created new organizations to support causes. Women have founded parishes and monasteries. Others stand up against corruption, abuse, or malfeasance within the church. Others are creating organizations to better build up the body of Christ. And these include leaders of such organizations today as St. Catherine's Vision, again, St. Phoebe, and along with such former organizations as the Women's Orthodox Ministries and Education Network. And then there are chaplains. These are women who have professional training to work as chaplains in environments such as hospitals, hospices, and prisons. There are church artists and artisans, and these are women who are iconographers, embroiderers, ecclesiastical tailors, graphic designers, and so on. And then there are church diplomats. These are women who represent the Orthodox Church in intra-Orthodox or ecumenical spheres, such as the World Council of Churches. And then there are clergy wives, and these are women who are married to priests and deacons and minister in that capacity, often with a profound pastoral impact on the life of a parish. There's no single expression of this role, though they often seem to be expected to undertake the highly diaconal roles of social coordination and sometimes even counseling. The actual role of a clergy wife was originally meant to be ministering to her husband, but as a result of what's actually in practice, our clergy wives are often more so than our ordained deacons, whose roles these days seem to be primarily liturgical. They're even more than them. They're completing and complementing the circle of unity and community, as Deacon John so beautifully put it. And then we have experts. Now, these are women who sit on diocesan and archdiocesan councils, commissions, and committees. These roles often call for a degree of expertise in a non-theological field. And data shows that hierarchs tend to prefer assigning clergy to advisory roles that demand a familiarity with theology, even though there are a host of laywomen with seminary training who could bring fresh and important perspectives. But the commissions and committees that women do sit on include family care, science and technology, canon law, liturgy and church art, Christian education, social and moral issues, international religious freedom, and religion and foreign policy. There's family, adult, and youth ministry. These are women who care for the well-being of marriages and families, or youth and adult parishioners, either in church or professional settings. There's finance. These are women who serve as treasurers of parishes, dioceses, or as chief financial officers of Orthodox institutions. And there's the homilists. Now, these are women who have received a formal blessing to deliver a sermon during church services. This is more common in some jurisdictions than others. And if you've never encountered the phenomenon, check out Fordham University's Orthodox Scholars Preach series. It's on YouTube. Then there are musicians. These are women who are parish choir directors or cantors or who have academic appointments related to music. There's parish and diocesan level leadership positions, and these are women who serve as parish council members or as metropolitan governing board members. When I was president at my former parish, 7 of the 10 parish council positions were held by women, and that is actually not an uncommon proportion in some of our jurisdictions. The readers. These are women who read the epistle and the divine liturgy, psalms and prayers and other services. However, almost always without a blessing or tantring. There's religious, although it does happen. Tantring has happened for women who are readers, but not very often. There's religious education. These are women who educate others regarding the Orthodox Church, both on the parish level as catechists of children and adults, and as authors and speakers. They're scholars. These are women in any number of scholarly fields related to the Orthodox Church. They're theologians, historians, ethicists, art historians, seminary professors, translators, and others. Spiritual advisors. These are women who serve as guides or companions on the spiritual path for others. This is a deep part of our Orthodox tradition, with abbesses or nuns serving informally as spiritual directors, and now there are accreditation programs for this as a profession or vocation. There are sisterhoods and women's guilds. These are women who come together in groups in many of our churches to work together to support the functioning of their parish and philanthropic outreach, such as Philoptophos and the GOA. I mean, you can quibble with me about whether all of these categories or any of them are technically diaconal, and I welcome the conversation. I mean, I'd really like to make the case, however, that they are de facto diaconal because they fulfill the very functions outside the liturgical ones that are associated with a holistic understanding of diaconia. And many of the roles I've mentioned and the women fulfilling them are acting with the knowledge and or formal blessing of their bishop, as is right or appropriate. But many are not, and that's not because anybody's going rogue. It's because the bishop doesn't see these roles as particularly important to the diocese, or hasn't seen fit to sanction or bless or celebrate the church building activity that's being performed by women. I can't say. But women are not set aside or ordained for this diaconal work. Doesn't matter, they're doing it anyway. They're doing this diaconal work, and they're doing it in great numbers. I mean, historical evidence, as we've heard, and as as we know, the historical precedent for deaconesses, it's undeniable. The need for deaconesses is pressing, given the crisis in pastoral care caused by an increasing lack of priests in our jurisdiction, plus the crisis in appropriate care for women in specific, which has led to so many sexual misconduct cases. But there's still no formal ordained women's diaconate to speak of. Part of this is because our various jurisdictions generally do not align who they tonsure or ordain with the roles that people actually perform. And we can hope that this changes someday. Whether that happens tomorrow, 10 years from now, or a century from now, there's work to be done, and someone has to do it. And women have been stepping up in astonishing numbers to perform much of the diaconal work that our people and our parishes require. And someday, we can only hope that the church actually recognizes that reality. So that's me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pat. I think your work, what you said tonight, but your work elsewhere too, for me has really expanded my knowledge of what women are doing and the diversity and breadth of what women are doing in the church today. And that helps all of us expand our imagination about these things. And I think personally, one of my takes on this issue is the church has a failure of imagination today. And so it's wonderful to push that and illumine that a little bit. Thank you so much. So it's time for questions. You are welcome to put questions in the chat, to type them there. You are also welcome to raise your Zoom hand, but I'm going to start us off and ask a question to any of our panelists. So Pat acknowledged that the consultation of Rhodes affirmed deaconesses to be ordained in word, but not in deed. We don't have deaconesses to speak of in the Orthodox Church today. So my question to our panelists is, what could we do to change that around and have it not just be in word, but also in deed? How could we leverage the consultation of Rhodes or other things to see this come about? Valerie, looked like maybe you were unmuting. Would you like to start?
You did. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, I forgot that I had already unmuted myself and it wouldn't let me go back. Well, there's two basic avenues. One is get a synod of bishops to agree with it as a synod, and then it becomes available throughout that particular church. The other is the courageous bishop approach. And I'm thinking here of somebody like St. Nectarios, who just went ahead and did it, and it's interesting when you look at what he did. Now he's doing this with the nuns, with several of the nuns at the monastery that he founded on the island of Aegina. And a big hullabaloo was raised about it. He kind of tried to get around it by saying, well, they're really more like subdeacons and stuff. But if you look at what he's actually doing, he was being very pragmatic, but he was also expanding their role from beyond the historical. So he had these ordained nuns doing petitions and reading the gospel, which were public liturgical acts that were not done in the early and Byzantine period by female nuns, as far as we know. Now, he may have gotten some of this from looking at what was happening with Armenian deaconesses, because around the time that the deaconesses were dying out, you have the institution of the female diaconate in the Armenian church around the 12th century, and then it sort of dies out, and then it gets revived big time in the 19th century, and that continues to the present day. But you know, he did not. These women were not unordained. You know, they were working in a women's monastery, and that was what the Church of Greece also had decided upon, that they were going to start in these remote women's monasteries. You know, and, but where our real need is in our parishes.
Mm.
Not that there isn't a need in the women's monasteries; they need it all. It's not an either or, but we really need this in our parishes. And I'm afraid that we're not going to find a bishop with the cojones to do this individually. Plus, there's the question of whether she would be recognized outside of that particular bishop's own diocese. So we do have to push the bishops within a given synod to move forward. And I don't know whether the best thing is to try and go back to getting the bishops in the Synod of Greece, who already had decided on this, you know, 20, 25 years ago, to actually do something about it, or to try and get the bishops in one of the jurisdictions here in North America to do it.
I can see that, Valerie, but I also heard, I was really struck by what Father Kalivas said, actually. And I do think it's true that, you know, the bishops have to agree to educate the people to make this happen. I mean, I've sort of, I'm reluctant to think that that's the case, but I think there would be a huge amount of pushback and without proper education of the people. And it strikes me that not the order, but the push to educate everybody is going to have to come from the bishop. So, you know, it's sort of a virtuous cycle, it sounds like, that needs to build. I mean, how do other such large things happen in the church?
Well, I think we've got an additional problem here, which is the reluctance of bishops in many of the jurisdictions to have a revived diaconate period as a permanent institution that is a full-time ministry or something approaching a full-time ministry. So in the Greek church in this country, we have few deacons, period. In some of the other jurisdictions in the OCA and the AOC, the Antiochian Archdiocese, we do have a lot of deacons, but they're doing almost nothing beyond liturgically helping out on Sunday mornings. So that's not a real ministry. And so we've got to look at this also within this broader context of pushing our bishops to recognize the importance of having a true diaconal ministry and getting the clergy to back it up. My cousin has been a big proponent. My cousin's father, Stephen Zichlis, and in Irvine, California at St. Paul's, and had really been pushing for the diaconate and has had enormous pushback from his fellow priests who somehow feel threatened about I'm not sure what they're threatened about. The deacon is generally serving under them in a parish. So, you know, I don't get it, but this is the reality that he's told me about.
Thank you for those perspectives. Father Kalivas, would you like to chime in here?
I think one of the important things you just said now, that it's, first of all, I doubt that any bishop on their own, without permission of a synod, would go ahead and ordain anyone to the diacon, a female diacon. So there has to be a sense of purpose within a synod to do this. And we were involved in this recently with Petros Vassiliadis, the professor and friend from Thessaloniki, who was involved with the Patriarchate of Alexandria, that was willing to move forward with the ordination of women, and thinking that this would be a very important ministry within the African church. But I have seen nothing move forward. And it seems to me rather that they're reluctant to move forward. perhaps because they've gotten a lot of pushback from the other churches. Not officially, but told that not to do this. I don't know that for a fact, but there's nothing from that original impetus that something is happening on the African continent. Nothing's been heard since. And unless we educate the people first, it's not going to go anywhere or go anywhere successfully.
Thank you for your perspective there. And for those who may not know, in the past few years, the Patriarchate of Alexandria in Africa has consecrated a few women as deaconesses, not ordained, but then this practice has sort of faded, and there have been questions from other churches. There have been questions from donors to the church in Africa that have complicated this process. So we have a few people who have their hands up, and I'm going to go to them now. We also have interesting things going on in the chat. And I encourage you again to put questions in the chat or raise your Zoom hand by going down to reactions and clicking that on the lower right part of your screen and raising your hand. But James Wilcox, you have been so patient. Thank you.
No worries.
Question.
Cool, thank you. When Dr. Valerie Karras was speaking, she was mentioning that at the time when women were ordained, that people were uncomfortable doing it, but they were still doing it. And I'm curious, does any of that uncomfortability tie into, say, like the old science of the day that, you know, incorrectly saw women's bodies as inferior to male bodies, and therefore, you know, like we see the Apostle Peter talking about women as the weaker vessel, so to speak.
Sure.
Is that part of why women were considered suspect? Would you, and feel free, anybody to chime in as is appropriate.
I think that certainly has something to do with women's roles in the church generally, you know, and in society more broadly beyond the church. If you look at the medical texts of the time, with the exception of someone like Soros, the typical view was that women were, yes, an inferior, maybe an incomplete man in development or something like that. You have people like Aristotle talking about, you know, how warm is the womb? And if the womb isn't warm enough, you get a woman. And if it's warm enough, you get a man. But I also think that there is the issue of ritual impurity, which starts making its way back into the church. And this was one of the areas that I had researched for my Catholic U dissertation. And I saw that there's a very sharp dichotomy between the churches of Antioch and Alexandria that develop on this issue. And I'm not talking here about differences in the two theological schools or the biblical schools of interpretation, but this is another issue, which is that question of how much of the Levitical law are we taking into the church with this notion of ritual impurity? Because what I found in my study was that this was not intrinsic to Greek culture. They did not have this notion of ritual impurity, but you see it developing in the Church of Alexandria, whereas the Church of Antioch is very strongly setting itself against it. And it may have something to do with the question of it being a foreign culture where the Jewish community in Antioch is Semitic in culture versus most of the Christian community being Greek in culture, versus in Alexandria, the Jewish community has become Hellenized. And so it's not seen as being distinct. So whereas you have church manuals and homilies from people like St. John Chrysostom in the Church of Antioch decrying the notion of ritual impurity and chastising women who are going to the mikvahs, who are going to the ritual baths, you know, and not receiving the Eucharist. You've got bishops in the Church of Alexandria saying that women shouldn't even be going into church when they're menstruating, let alone receiving the Eucharist. And that slowly makes its way into the broader Eastern Church. And so I think that has something to do also with this question of the high age for women so that they're basically postmenopausal. And also I do think again that it's that discomfort with that idea of sexualizing women. So by having them older and unmarried, they're as desexualized as they can make them, you know.
Thanks for those comments, Valerie. Now I know Father Kalivas, you also have worked on this issue of ritual impurity, and I wonder if you want to chime in here.
No, I think Valerie said it. It's unfortunately by the 11th century, 12th century, the Old Testament prescriptions came into practice, and they stayed for a long time. But even these services that we have in the church for the churching of a mother, and the other services for the pre-baptismal rites, they need to be rethought and recast. But who's going to have the will to do that? That's the big question.
I think, if I may, that it's really important too that the church, I think it would simply help if the church matched roles to how they're recognized. And I say this partly because I know a parish where there were 6 readers who were six women who were trained as readers, and none of them were tonsured, and they were told they weren't going to be tonsured. But within about a year, the first person to be tonsured as a reader in the parish was a 12-year-old boy. He was the son of the priest. That's fine. The issue was that he had fetal alcohol syndrome, and he actually wasn't able to read, which again, okay, that's, but then, and really, it sounds like I'm making it up, but about 8 months after that, the next person who was ordained was a 70-year-old altar server, and they wanted to tonsure him as a reader to honor his service. But he actually also had cognitive issues, and he couldn't read words that were longer than about 3 syllables clearly. So it's just, it's fine to honor people by tonsuring them. What I think is not fine is to call them readers if they can't actually read. If you want things read clearly, and you want to tonsure readers, you should tonsure the people who are actually reading properly. It's this kind of disconnect that I think tends to set up the sense that the Orthodox Church is by, for, and about men, which we know it's not, but it seems to me that there are a lot of people who think it is, if the only people that you think should be tonsured as readers are people who actually can't do it because they are male. That gives a very poor impression of the church and how it's run and who it's for. And that's the kind of practice I think it would be, if there's a way to align, role and title, it would be I think really important.
Thank you for those comments, Pat. I've often thought that if, tomorrow all the women who are reading in the church were tonsured, all the women who are chanting in the church were tonsured, it would really change everyone's perception of women in the church. It would be an overnight thing. So we have a very patient Noel Bush waiting with their hand up. Will you please ask your question?
Yeah, it's not so much a question, and it may be a rather simplistic and naive outlook, which I take full responsibility for. But we regard our Holy Orthodox Church as being countercultural. And yet we see in the culture of our day an assault on femininity. And from my point of view, the origins of that assault are in part a part of our history. And I see it and hear it in all of the comments this evening. How are we to deal with that? Progress is not made in long, courageous leaps, but oftentimes in nudges and notches. We have a difficult time involving women in serving Antediron, in holding communion cloths. Yes, many are reading the epistle. But come on, can't we take this in a measured approach, rather than looking to leap to the goal line in a very short period of time. Seems to me it's that measured approach which will earn the respect, admiration, and acceptance of the people. Just an observation.
Thank you very much for that observation. And I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here and give a thought of my own, but then I would love to hear from the panelists too. I hear what you're saying about the Orthodox Church not just blindly following the progress for the name of progress around us or the larger culture around us. You know, we are a people that have been willing to hold on to our tradition, but the measure of what we hold on to is what's true. It's not degree of change. It's not progress for the sake of progress. It's also not stasis for the sake of stasis. It's what's actually true. And so, you know, my response to you and my observation to you is I think the Orthodox Church needs to live up to its own teachings when it comes to women in the church. And that's one of the reasons I am here tonight and on the St. Phoebe board and so forth, is that is my conviction. Just do other panelists want to offer a thought here?
I see some of the things that have been said now, starting slow and moving forward is something good. Why not tonsure officially, therefore, appoint with an ecclesiastical title women in the church as readers, as chanting? Can the church even formulate a new order in the church among the minor orders? I mean, that would be very helpful. I think one of the great problems that we have in the church today is ritual formalism. We're holding on to the rituals, but not to the essence of what those rituals mean. And it was just pointed out so nicely. The reader within the Greek church, every community, when a bishop comes, they present a group of children, 10 years old, 11 years old, maybe even younger, to become quote readers of the church. And the people that are reading that prayer, the bishops and the priests are promoting this thing. The prayer says that this candidate of yours has the ability to read the scriptures, to know the scriptures, and to convey it through his own ability to articulate the reading of the scripture. So we have to be serious about what we say and do in the church, even liturgically. Maybe if we do that, maybe we'll come around to some things that are meaningful.
Thank you for those thoughts, Father Kalivas. And this seems like an appropriate time to remind everyone that our next event will be on girls and women's liturgical service. So we will have a chance to think about these issues in much more detail on June 25th. That's co-sponsored with Oxia Women, and you can find more information about that on our website. Would anyone, other panelists, like to respond to this issue? Shall we go on to another question? Let's go on to another question that I saw come up in the chat a little while back, which was a question about the relationship between what's happening in the Orthodox Church and what's happening in the Roman Catholic Church. In the Roman Catholic Church right now, there's also interest and a movement there to ordain women as deacons. And I think the question was, could the churches work together? And what is that relationship actually like? Panelists, would one of you want to address that?
Well, I've worked some with Phyllis Zagano, who is one of the contributors to the book and has been working on this question of female deacons and other ordained and consecrated women's ministries for decades now within the Roman Catholic tradition. She was the only American that Pope Francis appointed to this commission to study the female diaconate in the Catholic Church. It's interesting because they don't have as strong of a tradition as we do. And in fact, it's very clear that in many places in the West, from relatively early on, ordained were outlawed, although Although you have at the same time this curious phenomenon of men being ordained together with their wives as if to a shared ministry. And Gary Macy has done some research and writing on that. I do think that it's an area where we can look at these things together, but we also have to recognize at the same time that there are differences in ecclesiology and in the understanding of orders between the Orthodox and the Catholics. So that, for instance, deacons in the Roman Catholic Church can do things that they cannot do in the Orthodox churches. So they can witness weddings. And part of that is because their sacramental theology makes the two people being married the actual ministers of the sacrament. The deacons can perform baptisms in the Roman Catholic Church, whereas in the Orthodox churches, that would be done only in an emergency situation. And if you look at early church manuals, such as the Apostolic Constitutions, you see these strong injunctions against deacons doing baptisms by themselves without the bishop present. And then in that particular document, there's a second injunction specifically about female deacons not doing baptisms by themselves. And my guess is that that second injunction is there because in the case of men getting baptized, the bishop would have been right there next to the deacon who was assisting him with the baptism, whereas in the case of a female catechumen, it's the deaconess who is literally doing the baptism, physical baptism by herself, and then the bishop will read the prayers over her afterwards, or in one document, there's like a slit in a curtain. He kind of sticks his hand through, does it that way. But you can see where people would start to see the deacon as being the celebrant of the baptism, because he's the one doing the act of helping the person into the water and all. So we do have these differences in our sacramental theology, our theology of orders, to be aware of. But we also have a 2,000-year tradition going back, which, aside from the Anglican communion, you don't have that in any of the Protestant churches.
I think I would just like to raise something, and following up on an earlier thread, is that I often hear it said that, the Orthodox Church doesn't want to follow the secular world in women becoming deaconesses. The secular world couldn't care less if women are deaconesses. The secular world couldn't care less if women get appropriate spiritual care. The secular world, to some extent, it cares whether, male priests are overstepping boundaries and ending up in sexual malfeasance lawsuits. That they get involved. But, it's for us to decide whether women should have appropriate spiritual care without worrying about, inappropriate or worse things happening. And I'm not saying that all priests cause this problem, but you have to think, if you're a female, you actually have to think about this, and you have to think about whether the ordained person that you're talking to can understand what you're talking about and can really get your issues. And I will have to say that some do and many don't. And it's an issue. And until men who are in power in the Orthodox Church care about these things, we won't have that. And the secular world couldn't care less whether we get those things. The secular world is not driving this bus, so it's ridiculous to say that it is. And it's also, and I actually don't even understand where femininity comes into it. There's nothing unfeminine about wanting appropriate spiritual care. There just isn't. And there's nothing unfeminine about women undertaking the spiritual care of other women. I have no understanding of where femininity comes into that whatsoever. Women are caretakers. Men are caretakers, but there's nothing unfeminine about taking care of somebody spiritually, physically, or mentally. And there's nothing unmasculine about it. There's nothing inherently masculine about it either. It's just, it makes no sense to me, that particular question or argument. So anyway, I'm going to leave that there.
Okay.
Actually, I'm sorry, I just wanted to add something. It sort of harkens back to what Noel had raised earlier too. It's ironic that this becomes an issue in certain quarters of the Orthodox community today, because it was an issue for early Christianity. Early Christians were seen as completely upending the traditional roles of men and women, and in particular through consecrated celibacy, through early monasticism. They were seen as being very dangerous to femininity and to the family. And we have a whole series of women who are kind of transvestite saints because they dressed up as men to go into monasteries, to live their lives in the way they wanted, to do their service to the church and their ministry to the church, unbound by the restrictions that their family and society placed on them as women.
I've heard it said actually that for men to become saints, they have to take on feminine characteristics, classically feminine characteristics, and vice versa. That women have to become, and when women to become saints, they have to take on more so-called masculine characteristics of being more assertive or whatever. And this is not from me. I just heard it said by.
No, I think that's really at the whole basis of monasticism.
Now to other questions,
Okay,
if that's
sure.
okay. Thank
Sorry.
you. I want to make sure we get to a few more questions, being conscious of our time. We have about 11 more minutes together here, but I do just want to read one comment from the chat from Judith Scott in response to this issue of kind of rate of change and changes influenced by the secular world. She writes, "We don't go slowly and wait because there are girls and women today who are called today, who are ready today, or who can walk away rather than being overlooked and humiliated. How many generations have to wait for what? For men to consider them worthy?" I wanted to acknowledge that comment and also say that, my observation is that there's a silent schism happening in the church today. Often the fear of division is what's raised against having deaconesses in the church again, but the division is happening as we sit here. So I'm going to go to James Spiros, who has been very patient also. Thank you. And we would love to hear your question.
Okay. Thank you so much. Ultimately, I think much of this comes down to leadership and the will to make it happen. So my question is, where is the synod today, the Holy Synod today on the issue? Where is the Ecumenical Patriarch on the issue? And do we know? And how do we get this on the agenda? This is my first introduction to this group, but as I listen to it, being an old retired guy, I keep coming back to, leadership is the art of achieving results through people, and it has to start with the leadership of the church. Of course, you could do this in a sort of groundswell sort of effort, and it would probably take quite a long time. But I'm more inclined to say, how do we get this on the agenda with the Holy Synod?
Great question. Thank you. Any of our panelists want to take that?
Well, Jim, good to see you. My neighbor and good friend. We'll talk at St. Demetrius about it too. It probably starts with you, meaning that all the lay people in the church have to be heard. Let your voices rise up. I don't know what the bishops in the synod are thinking. I certainly don't know what the patriarch is thinking, but they will respond in kind to the people, to the will of the people. So I think in this instance, with all these things, the people have to start talking up. The organizations that are here represented have to make their voice loud and clear. And this way it gets on the agenda, of the synods. Not only here, but around. Even in our own assembly of bishops are very willing to listen to these things, and how willing. It may take a few years, but it's got to start somewhere. And let the laity also speak up.
I agree with Father Kalivas. I mean, I don't know a great deal about this issue, but I can guarantee you if men who are concerned, men who have bishops' ears, if they are concerned about their wives, their daughters, the other women, their co-workers, women they see in their parishes, if they actually feel concern for them, and if they have a bishop's ear, the bishops are far more likely, I hate to say it, they are far more likely to listen to men who are close to them, who they know, than they are to someone like me, who they probably don't know, and who runs an organization that has women in its name, whom they expect to be, I hate to say it, annoying. So it's they're much more likely to it's the people that they're likely to listen to that it would really help that if those people would speak up, and that we could get some progress with that. It's going to take time.
Thank you. Let me
Like
say here too, I think it'd be helpful to say that the St. Phoebe Center, our thinking about this is that it needs to come from all sides. That, we, the people, the lay people of the church, or the non-hierarchs of the church, need to learn about this, talk about this, raise these concerns with our hierarchs. And then we also need that leadership piece too. And Father Tony acknowledged that the Ecumenical Patriarch does have a message in this new volume, in this book, where he affirms the need for deaconesses in the church today. But I think the real question is, will this be another in word but not in deed kind of affirmation? And that's what we're all kind of wondering. So Carrie Lambrakis, Dr. Carrie Lambrakis, an advisory board member of the St. Phoebe Center, also has been very patient, and your patience is now rewarded, and we would love to hear your question.
Thank you very much, Carrie. Christ is risen. So I wanted to make a couple of points, and I put it in the chat. Number one, young women are leaving our church because they don't feel they're a part of it. That's criminal. Another part of the problem is that most Orthodox faithful do not know about this movement. I only learned about it 4 years ago. I'm an archon in the of the Order of St. Andrew, as is fellow brother Archon Jim Spiros. I see male voices need to be raised. I am raising it very loudly. I am bringing a resolution to the Clergy Laity Conference in the metropolis of New Jersey for the metropolis to move to the Archdiocese Clergy Laity to increase and further develop the role of women in the church. I'll try to be real brief. Carrie and I and Kira Limbarakis, my daughter, and George Dimakopoulos met with the Archbishop last November. It took about 5 minutes for that actually to be publicized. But in fact, the Archbishop did say that we can move in incremental steps in the direction of a female diaconate. I don't know if we'll see it in our lifetime, but I will be pushing for it. But we need to make steps slowly and steadily. And if a resolution can be passed from the New Jersey metropolis, then perhaps in Boston, the Archdiocesan District, Atlanta, across the country, if the voices are made louder, they can't be ignored. We need to push gently the Archdiocese in the direction of the further development of women in our church. And I get passionate about it, so I'm going to tone down the level here and just tell all of you women out there. Peter Skiatis, I forgot to mention you, Brother Archon. This is what we want. This is what we need for the church to survive. 50% of its faithful need to be involved. not just the other 50%. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carrie. And, thank you for this resolution. May it be blessed. And thank you for all of your efforts. And thank you to you and the other archons that are here tonight. We're really happy to have you here. So now I'm going to go. I think this will probably be our last question because we're near the end of our time together. But we have one of the editors of the volume, Marilyn Rouvelas, raising her hand. Marilyn, welcome. It's so nice to see you. And we'd love to hear your question.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for hosting this. It's been a wonderful panel. I don't have a question. I just would like to answer one of the questions is, what does a patriarch think about this? We're talking about Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. I had the honor of meeting with him in person and asked him, would you be willing to ordain a woman or have one of your bishops ordain a woman? And he said to me, well, the conscience of the church isn't ready yet. And I didn't know what to say. And later I asked someone, a clergyman, what does that mean? And he said, that means that the people are talking to the bishops. So what Carrie just said and what you all are talking about talking and getting out there and talking to your clergymen and bishops is what we need to do. Because I think if the patriarch can hear that his bishops are coming saying, hey, we're hearing a lot about this, maybe we should do something. That's the only way it's going to move. Apparently it's too hard to come down from the top. They're too afraid.
Thank you for that acknowledgement of reality, Marilyn. And this is a great place to conclude because I can point out that the St. Phoebe Center is doing this work. We are talking to bishops and we invite you to join us in doing that. Join our network, and that's a place where we're going to teach people how to approach their bishops, give them some language to do that, people who would like to engage in that way. Also, this is something we will be working on in November 10 through 12 at Holy Cross Hellenic College with our conference there. We will have a session on these kind of pragmatic issues of how to speak to hierarchs and how to move this issue forward. So thank you again. Father Tony, if you're still here, I will ask you to say a prayer for us at the very end. Is Father Tony still here?
I am still here.
Great.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Please take it away.
Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and on those in the tombs bestowing life. O heavenly God, you revealed your resurrection first to the women who came to the tomb to minister to your body. We ask that you reveal yourself to all the women of our church so that their ministries to your body in the body of Christ can be expanded through the orders of our church in all that we do. And we ask this in the name of our risen Lord, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Father Tony. Thank you, all of you, for being with us. Thank you to our panelists. This has been a wonderful evening together, and I hope to see you again soon. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.